Gresham College presents English Architecture and the First World War by Simon Thurley, CBE, visiting Gresham Professor of the Built Environment.
So this evening I'm going to be talking about the First World War. It's one of two lectures that are very closely aligned about the effects of the First World War on Britain and on its architecture, particularly in the interwar period. When we think about the First World War, which of course broke out in 1914, it was an extraordinary event because it was the first time for 100 years that England had been involved in a European conflict. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 had actually ended Britain's military engagement in Europe for a century. In fact, I think you could even say that since 1871 there had been no major war between European powers. And so nobody really quite knew what this new war would actually be like. Those who had the time to think about it and those who had the responsibility of thinking about it imagined troops marching into a series of set-piece battles where the outcome would be rapidly decided. Well, this, of course, was a traditional view and a view which, as we all know, was to be proved wrong. But every element of the beginning of the war was based on tradition. The mustering of troops for this new conflict followed traditional lines. During the Crimean War, the government had been forced to rely on the historic county and town militias to boost regular troops in the field. And what this did was expose Britain's lack of military capacity, and it led to a fear that if Britain were to be sucked into a European war in the late 1850s, and there were a couple of them around, the Second Italian War of Independence was the one they were most worried about, there was a fear that Britain wouldn't be able to cope. And so, in 1859, a new volunteer rifle corps was established to defend coastal towns and to harass a possible invading enemy. After 1862, these bands became increasingly centralised and more closely aligned with the regular army, and in 1907 they were reconstituted as the Territorial Army. From the 1860s, these volunteer bands built themselves drill halls in which to train. In all, as many as 1,800 of these buildings were constructed across England, normally paid for by their own members and through local fundraising. The most obvious characteristic of these buildings was their large central halls, which were normally about 100 foot long and perhaps 50 to 60 feet wide. And they were used for marching and for weapons practice. And my photograph here shows what I think is the County of London Batteries Hall in Shepherd's Bush. And some of the larger ones, and this was quite a large one because you can see it was one of the artillery bands, had a library or a billiard room attached for special occasions, and there was almost always a house attached where the caretaker would live. I'm now showing you the drill hall in Northampton, a large, imposing headquarters which was built around 1880. The Tudor military style, which you sort of see here, was a very popular style for these structures and was felt to be very appropriate for these buildings. Here is the large and very showy drill hall in Lincoln, built at a cost of £10,000 and paid for by the city industrialist and MP Joseph Ruston. It's recently been restored and now is a very successful arts centre. This was completed in 1890 to the design of Goddard & Son, and as well as the main hall here, it had, amongst other luxurious facilities, a men's club, a firing range, an armoury, and a gymnasium. These two were quite showy halls. Here is a much smaller one, now demolished, this red brick structure in Stourbridge in Worcestershire, perhaps a little bit more typical of what you'd find in the smaller towns. Well, At the outbreak of the Second World War on the 4th of August 1914, it was to these drill halls built from the 1860s that men rushed to sign up. All of them had to receive basic training before being sent abroad. And it soon became very clear that preparation in one particular type of combat was going to be paramount. And that was, of course, trench warfare. So what happened was that the government built several systems of practice trenches across the country. And many of these remarkably still survive, although they can usually only be seen from the air. They were normally built on existing military training grounds, such as Salisbury Plain. And here, in fact, you can see a picture of Salisbury Plain from the air, Beacon Hill, and Bulford. Sometimes there was other types of government land that was used. Here are some other practice trenches at Redmires on the western side of Sheffield. And it was here where the 1,100 strong Sheffield's Pals battalion trained. Here there were full-scale trenches dug into the hills, crawl trenches and miniature trench models. The trenches at Barham in Kent only survive as soil marks, but here we actually have a photograph. This isn't on the Western Front, this is in Kent. And here they are training in the use of field telephones. Many of these temporary encampments turned into huge gatherings of men. Many thousands of men had to be accommodated. Some of them, like these from the London Territorial Regiment, were billeted in bell-like tents. This is at Larkhill Camp near Stonehenge. And later, thousands and thousands of tin huts were built, such as these, which are also at Larkhill, photographed in 1915. So you see, England very, very quickly became this huge training ground for many millions of soldiers. But in the early stages of the war, England was actually bombed too. And this is a little-known episode. The Imperial German Navy was trying to lure the Royal Navy out into a destructive battle in the North Sea, and so it started shelling the British coast. On the 16th of December 1914, it shelled Scarborough and Whitby. And this is Whitby Abbey, photographed immediately after being shelled by the German Navy in 1914. Hartlepool was shelled very heavily. 1,000 rounds were fired at the town. 86 people were killed, 400 injured. And here you see some damage in the centre of the town. In fact, for a time, various slogans like "Remember Scarborough" replaced "Remember Belgium" on recruiting posters. Well, when the land offensive began and the Neuve-Chapelle offensive failed in May 1915, a lot of blame was thrown around, and one of the things that people thought had held the British Army back was a shortage of shells. Too few shells and too many which didn't explode when they hit the ground. The Liberal government was brought down, and the new coalition passed an act which brought all armaments manufacture in England under a Ministry of Munitions. And by 1918, this ministry governed 250 factories and supervised 20,000 more. Rotherwas was one of the national factories. This was a 500-acre site devoted to filling shells with picric acid and amatol. And in the last months of the war, it was also involved with mustard gas. And this, which I show you on here, is an incredibly rare building. Almost every single one of the World War I factories have now gone, but this is one of the picric acid stores still surviving on the site. It's recently been listed. As industrial production stepped up and even more men were taken abroad for active service, almost 600,000 women became munitioneers at Rotherwas. I don't have a picture of them working at Rotherwas, but I do have a picture of them here at Woollett Arsenal. And what they were busy doing was filling shells and manufacturing other types of war hardware. And I found in the English Heritage Archive in Swindon a very rare photograph here. These are the Cunard works in Birkenhead, as you can see, entirely manned by women. The work was relatively well paid, but it was very risky. And many women involved in this activity were slowly poisoned by the chemicals they work with, and others were killed in explosions. In 1916, in a factory in Faversham, 108 workers were killed in an explosion and now lie in this mass grave, which I'm showing you here, another structure that has been recently listed in preparation of the commemoration of the First World War. Factories were not just taken over willy-nilly. Generally speaking, particular tasks were allocated to areas where particular skills had already grown up. So, for instance, in Lancaster, where there were the factories of the celebrated furniture makers, Waring and Gillow, this was turned over to the manufacture of biplanes. And in Somerset, these are the now ruined Tone Mills, where woolen worsted was made. It was a place which had the license to make khaki. This was where all the uniforms were manufactured, the cloth uniforms were manufactured. Well, of course, prosecuting the First World War was a cripplingly expensive activity, and the government appealed to the public as a patriotic duty to take out war savings and war bonds. There were all sorts of novel promotions, including the so-called tank banks. You won't have heard of these. This is a rather remarkable exercise which involved tanks touring the country in 1917 to 1918 to raise support for saving. And at the end of the war, 264 of the most generous towns across England were presented with a battle-scarred tank, usually displayed in a public park or an open space. And the picture you see here is of the tank presented to the town of Deal. Now, unfortunately, most of these went for scrap in the Second World War, but for those of you who are really keen to see one, just one survives. It's at Ashford in Kent. Probably survived because, utterly bizarrely, it was used as an electricity substation from 1929. Now, of course, one reason why tanks were used in this way was because they were novel bits of technology and they would draw the crowds. Another demonstration, at least to the civilian population, that this was a war that was being fought with new technology in a new way, came with the first air raids. England became the first country in the world to have the dubious distinction of sustaining major civilian casualties from aerial bombardment. The first Zeppelin raids on the East Coast and then in London took place in January 1915, and they continued into that summer. There were 20 raids in all, resulting in more than 500 killed and 1,300 wounded. Here is bomb damage in Hull. Anti-aircraft defences were completely useless, and this led to a big shake-up in 1916 when more anti-aircraft guns, more searchlights, and 10 home fighter squadrons were introduced. And finally, on the night of 2nd of September 1916, a Zeppelin was actually shot down. At this point, the Germans switched their tactics to use these heavy Gotha bombers. This is from May 1917. And they started coming over first in daylight, and then at night. In the very first raid, Cleopatra's Needle was peppered with shrapnel, and you can still see the scars to this very day. These Gotha raids killed many more than the Zeppelins, and here you can see just not so far from here a listed building in the Inns of Courts with its shrapnel damage from, in fact, the final raid of May 1918, when 41 planes attacked London and 72 bombs were dropped. And that was, in fact, that raid of 1918 was the last air raid in London before the Second World War Blitz. Other reminders of London's first, and I should say forgotten, Blitz are various memorials. This is one in Cuffley in Hertfordshire to mark the spot where Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson achieved the first successful downing of an airship. That was in September 1916. He was awarded the VC for doing it. Another memorial not very far from here at the Museum of London is in North Street, Poplar, where a school was hit by an air raid and 18 children was killed. And that was in the first Gotha raid on London in June 1917. Well, of course, very quickly, the government realised that anti-aircraft defences were going to be crucial. And 1912 proved the formative year. This was the year in which the Royal Flying Corps was founded. And 2 batteries of anti-aircraft defences, the very first of these types of buildings to be built anywhere in the world, were planned on the Hoo Peninsula in Kent, obviously overlooking the Thames estuary. And here you see some remarkable remains of some First World War anti-aircraft batteries. A number of different types were begun. This is the Lodge Hill battery in a reconstruction drawing at which 3-inch guns were installed alongside barracks and other types of accommodation. And there were about 35 of these built along the coast. Well, once the war started, the Royal Flying Corps rapidly expanded. There were new squadrons, new aerodromes. In fact, there were 250 of them by the end of the First World War. And this very rapid evolution of the technology and the buildings that were required is extremely interesting, but it's very, very difficult for us to understand today because so many of these sites were reused during the Second World War, and all the remains from the First World War, from those early pioneer days, have been swept away. But remarkably, an aerodrome does survive at Stowe Mares in Essex, and from here in 1917, sorties were flown against the Gotha bombers as they launched their first attacks on London. These were abandoned in 1918, but it's lost its hangars, but otherwise it's essentially complete. And only last week it won one of English Heritage's Angel Awards for the astonishing restoration that's been undertaken there by volunteers. I recommend that you go and look at it. A very, very rare survival. Some hangars do survive, not at Stowe Mares. If you go to the Imperial War Museum's site at Duxford in Cambridgeshire, you can see one of the very, very rare surviving First World War hangars. These were built in 1917 to 18 using labour provided by German prisoners of war. And each hangar accommodated an entire Royal Flying Corps squadron. One other hangar survives, which is really very remarkable. This was built in about 1918. This was a seaplane hangar. And it was moved in the early 1920s from Newhaven Seaplane Station, where it had been built, to a railway yard in Wimbledon, where, rather remarkably, it remains in use to this very day. One other response to the German air offensive, alongside these fighter squadrons and the AK stations, was a rather remarkable invention called the sound mirror. And these were built from 1916 onwards on the south and northeast coasts of England. They were a sort of early form of radar. They're very simple in conception. There was a sort of concave mirror reflecting sound into a central microphone. And on a good day, they could pick up the sound of an incoming aircraft about 15 miles away. Obviously, bad weather reduced their efficacy, as did aircraft that travelled ever faster. This surviving one, which I'm showing you a picture of here, very, very rare thing, is at Nammy Hill in Sunderland, and is one of only 4 First World War examples that survive on a whole chain of these things that stretch from the Humber all the way up to the River Tyne. Now, none of the things I've been showing you over the last 15 minutes or so was great architecture. It was an immediate response to an overwhelming national crisis. It brought a war that was otherwise entirely fought overseas into the forefront of people's everyday experience. It also introduced new building types, new inventions, new technology, new ways of thinking about organising people and organising processes. But just before I go on to look at what this meant for architecture after the war had ended, I briefly want to turn to the issue of commemoration. Taking the British Empire as a whole, very roughly 9 million men were mobilised over the course of the war. Of these, 1 million men were killed and 2 million were wounded. In March 1915, as a result of direct pressure from the Graves Registration Commission, which later on became the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, repatriation of bodies to England was banned. And this was because it was taking up a huge amount of logistics, getting the bodies back across the Channel. And so the idea and design of government-sponsored war cemeteries rapidly formed. And so it was that the great majority of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries now lie abroad, where actually men fell. But in England, there were actually large numbers of graves and some cemeteries, the resting place of servicemen and women who died of their wounds, illness, or mishap while they were training. Here is Brookwood Cemetery near Bagshot, the largest of the English First World War cemeteries. British and American cemeteries were separated out as separate zones in 1917. It was extended in the Second World War. This is the German cemetery on Cannock Chase, where downed Zeppelin crews were buried. In fact, German personnel from the First World War now lie along personnel from the Second World War in this cemetery. And equally striking is this very unusual cemetery, the Muslim burial ground established near Woking in 1917 for Indian Army soldiers who died of their wounds while they were in England. In fact, it's now empty of its war dead because they were moved to Brookwood Cemetery in 1968, but you can still go and see this very haunting and beautiful little cemetery in Woking today. Other memorials to those who served and fell are typically more local. There may be something like 100,000 war memorials celebrating, or commemorating, I should say, the First World War in England. They come in all shapes and sizes and in many types. Here is the corporate memorial that I actually pass most days because it's outside my office, in the middle of the Prudential Insurance Company headquarters in Holden, designed by F.V. Blunston in 1922. But there were, of course, community memorials all over the country. This is one in Bridgnorth in Shropshire, the very good sculpture on the top, done in 1820 by Adrian Jones. But there were other types of memorials too. There were village halls, there were playing fields. You can see here a park in Lancashire, marked on this map, Memorial Park. And here, at Oundle School, in Northamptonshire, a chapel designed by A.C. Blomfield as a memorial to remember the 222 staff and pupils who were amongst the First World War dead. I think just spending a few moments considering commemoration, considering those 100,000 war memorials, helps to emphasise the enormous impact that the First World War had on English society. And of course, it also had a huge impact on the social policy of subsequent post-war governments. The scale and the intensity of the conflict involved more or less the whole population. And as the resources to fight this all-out war became greater and greater, the commitment of the government to make social reforms after the war became a sort of unwritten social contract. In other words, as the war progressed, it became only possible to continue to fight if there was a prospect of a better world for its returning survivors. And at the centre of this promise of a better world was housing policy. To quote Walter Long, the president of the local government board, "To let them come home from the horrible, waterlogged trenches to something little better than a pigsty here would indeed be criminal. It would be a negation of all that we have said during the war, which is that we can never repay those men for what they have done for us." Well, we saw in my last lecture how gradually the worst Victorian slums were being replaced and improved by a combination of legislation, technology, and an increasing sense of responsibility amongst landlords. But the big realisation after the First World War was that private enterprise alone would not and could not bring changes in the quality and quantity of housing fast enough. By 1918, it had become accepted that it would be necessary to use central government finance to subsidise local authorities to build houses. In 1918, there were probably 600,000 houses too few in England. And by 1921, there were probably 800,000 houses too few. Put simply, this meant that many returning servicemen returned to a situation that was worse than the one which they had left. And they were forced to move in with their parents or move in with their in-laws, and many were forced to occupy temporary accommodation, like railway carriages. Private investors were simply not building new rented accommodation because rents had been legally capped in 1915 at 1914 levels, and therefore there was simply no money in building speculative rented accommodation. Now, I'm not going to spend much time this evening on describing to you the plethora of committees, acts of parliaments and regulations that were established between 1918 and 1925. What I want to concentrate on is what was built and why it was different from what was being built before the First World War. In short, what had actually changed. Well, I think the first point, and perhaps the most important one, is that before the First World War, it was the middle classes who had moved out of city centres to create suburbia. But after 1919, the decision to build new houses on the principle of the garden city meant that most new working class housing was going to be far from the city centres, where the old crowded and discredited slums had once been. Probably the most spectacular spectacular example of this work was undertaken by the London County Council, which built enormous estates outside what was then London in areas of former farmland. And the largest of these was the Beckon estate, which you see here in my photograph, under construction in 1927. This huge estate was built on open land where farms and barns and hedges were simply bulldozed to make way for the new houses. The estate was begun in 1921 and was designed as what was known as a cottage garden estate, where parks, gardens and green spaces were seen as being just as important as the houses themselves. Over 300 acres of land were compulsorily purchased in the boroughs of Dagenham, Ilford and Barking. A 500-foot-long jetty was built on the River Thames so that building materials could be easily brought in by barge. It took 10 years to build, and when it was completed, it was the largest housing estate anywhere in the world. 27,000 houses provided new homes for over 100,000 people. And these houses were intended to be for what were considered to be at the time the better off working class Londoner. And most of them were very large. 2/3 of all interwar council houses had 3 bedrooms. And they were all fitted with gas and electricity, inside WCs, fitted baths, and front and back gardens. And in this way, between 1919 and 1939, England gained 4 million new houses, 1.5 million of which were subsidised by central government. This was an astonishing change, because by the eve of the Second World War, 30% of all the houses in England were new. Astonishing statistic, 30% of all the English houses had been built in the previous 30 years, and these houses had vastly improved facilities and were substantially larger. And this, of course, transformed the lives of millions of people. And one of the big characteristics of these new suburban estates was that they changed the lives of working men, because these men no longer lived close to where they worked. It now became necessary to commute. There was a massive explosion of buses and bus routes after the war, but the construction of new housing was also accommodated by a vast extension of the rail network, particularly in London, the Underground. In fact, some rail companies, particularly the Metropolitan Rail Company, became property developers. They, in fact, built 10 estates along their new line to Uxbridge and Amersham. This is the Woollett Estate at Amersham, one of the Metropolitan Railway Company's investments of the 1930s. Here they'd purchased land in 1930 at a cost of £18,000. And by 1935, they had built 535 semi-detached houses, which you could buy at a cost of £875. Now there's something to think about to make you happy on your way home this evening. Very fine houses they were too. The Metropolitan line was still a separate enterprise, but most of the other underground lines were owned by the Underground Group, and these were extended to meet the massive growth of London. What this map shows is the extraordinary rate of growth of London in the immediate years after the First World War. And what you're looking at is the grey areas there, which is the vast expansion that took place after 1918. And it was serviced by these new railways. The Central Line was extended to Ealing in 1920, the Northern Line to Edgware and Morden in 1922 to 24, and the Piccadilly Line to Cockfosters, Uxbridge and Hounslow in 1932 to 3. The managing director of the Underground was Frank Pick, an able and imaginative man who wanted to give his new stations a recognisable corporate design style. And his architect was Charles Holden. And Holden and Pick went on a European research trip in 1930 to try and crystallise their ideas for these new underground stations. They were particularly struck by the work of contemporary Dutch and Swedish architects, and their influence can be seen in his station designs. Sudbury Station was to be the prototype for what Holden called his brick boxes with concrete lids. And here you can see all the elements that were to appear in his latest stations. These very elegant long horizontal lines, and often very long extended vertical lines too. Red brick, smooth concrete, metal window frames, glazed tiles. Occasionally a tower was added, or a drum, as at Arnos Grove that you see here. The interiors were sleek and modern, but simple and less expensive than they looked, relying on standardised and mass-produced materials. This is the foot of the escalators at Arnos Grove. Holden was very aware of how light should be used, both underground and above ground, because he realised that the stations had to be seen clearly and look good at night time. Holden's stations clearly looked very different from underground stations and indeed many other buildings built before the First World War. They were cleaner, more geometrical, more sculptural even. Here is Holden's massive new headquarters for London Underground, built over St James's Park Station. This was a modern building, but not a modernist building in a stylistic sense. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, modernism is another one of those terrible art historical terms that mean everything and absolutely nothing. It is a word that is used architecturally to describe a movement that started in Germany in the late 19th century that rejected revivalism, that rejected classicism and eclecticism, and sought to create a new style based on the capabilities of new materials, steel, glass and concrete. And in practice, this led to a greater concentration on expressing function and turning their back almost entirely on any type of ornament. Well, Holden's buildings, and you can see that in this building, which had a lot of sculpture on it, in fact, cannot be said to do these things wholeheartedly. And indeed, I think that Holden's buildings were really extensions of the classical tradition that had prevailed before the First World War. And this building, 55 Broadway, I think in many ways characterises the style of the interwar years in England. There were some modern movement buildings, some private houses, some exhibition buildings, some factories, but they were in a tiny, tiny minority. English architecture between the wars remained rooted in traditional styles, especially in variants of classical architecture. Now, just to make this point, I want to look at a couple of buildings that did, in fact, turn their back on traditional and historical styles. And perhaps the earliest of these was an exhibition building. The Royal Horticultural Society New Hall, designed by Howard Robertson and John Murray Easton in 1927. It was the first to introduce these big, sweeping concrete curves that had been used on the continent, particularly in Scandinavia. This was a building that didn't draw on an historical canon for its references. It relied on its engineering to give it its style and its distinction. The same could, I think, be said of Owen Williams's boots factory in Nottingham of 1933. An intensely practical building, expressive of its structure. Long, low. It's in fact a stack of superimposed concrete slabs supported by internal columns, and only given a facade by these huge horizontal ribbons of steel and crittle windows. The packaging hall inside is an atrium 183 metres long, 23 metres wide, and 21 metres high. It's crossed at each level by a narrow bridge, creating a stack of 4 bridges. 28 conveyor belts run between the hall and the stores. And his roof, the roof of this atrium, a steel truss with cast concrete purlins and a concrete slab punctuated by cylindrical glass block skylights, was incredibly innovative and went to form a model that was to be copied elsewhere later. Boots was an American-owned company, and the American influence is very much seen in the size of this building. European factories had generally been broken up into much smaller units. And the Boots factory came, I think, out of Williams's experience while he was working for the American Trust Concrete and Steel Company, for whom he was chief engineer from 1912 to 1916. I'm going to give you one more example of these modernist buildings. Here, again, a short walk from the Museum of London, is a public building, the Finsbury Health Centre, designed by Berthold Lubetkin and his practice Tecton in 1933-5. Tecton's aim was to try and improve the health of the citizens of Finsbury by centralising healthcare and medical services in a single place, while offering patients a bright, clean and modern atmosphere. This is their diagram, which shows the logic of their design. And it's an argument about how their principles of design could help transform the lives of the working class of Finsbury, who were then living in cramped, dark, Victorian conditions. This building argued that by building a new architecture that rejected buildings of the past, society itself could be new too. But, as I have said, these buildings, as innovative and as exciting as they may have been, were not in the mainstream. And I think it's notable that they were, on the whole, designed by people who had come from elsewhere. From 1933, a stream of émigrés came from Nazi Germany, and others came from Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. English interests were, in fact, very, very different. You see, the First World War had had an extraordinary impact on the English. Rather than turning to the hard-edged modern movement architecture of steel, glass and industry, the war made people in England yearn for the countryside, for traditional cottages, for parish churches, Tudor mansions and the England of olden time. The interwar years in England were culturally intensely retrospective. The term often used to describe the art of the period is Neoromanticism. The most prominent artists weren't based in towns and cities, as they were to be after the Second World War, but they all fled to country villages. Henry Moore at Much Haddam, Stanley Spencer at Cookham. Think of Vaughan Williams, think of John Betjeman's Shell Guides to the Countryside. John Piper was busy painting English country churches. In fact, the vast bulk of what was built between the wars grew out of the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century. The war didn't force people to turn their backs on the past, it made them yearn for it. So what do I mean by arts and crafts? Well, here I'm afraid is another ghastly stylistic term, which as usual doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. But I think it can be summarised as a movement that gathered pace in reaction to the standardised and industrialised and mechanised design that was being produced in England. And this reaction against this sort of design started to build up from the 1870s. And arts and crafts put a new emphasis on craftsmanship and individuality. Well, like many ideas that started off with idealism, arts and crafts came to be diluted and popularised and ended up with being a general admiration for the Tudor and Elizabethan period of design. In the way that this was replicated, it had no less mass-produced feel than the industrial architecture that it had originally rebelled against. Millions of homes were given Elizabethan steep gables and timber framing. Sometimes it was done with real wood, as here in these houses on the Hanger Hill Garden Estate in Ealing, designed by Douglas Smith and Barley. Other times, like these houses in Kingsbury, the Tudor details are simply painted on with a pot of black paint. Well, while it's true to say that in terms of sheer numbers, the interwar years were dominated by volume house building in these very sort of derivative styles, there were, of course, some great buildings designed in the ongoing classical tradition. The greatest of the architects was Sir Edwin Lutyens, the man chosen to design the National Memorial for the First World War in Whitehall, a sort of stylised stone coffin. And his view of classicism was that it was what he called the essence that was important, the essence of classicism. And what this allowed him to do was leave behind the decoration and produce a sort of abstraction of ancient architecture. His most remarkable English public building is only 5 minutes' walk away from here, and I recommend that you make a detour on your way home to Bank Tube to have a look at it. This is the Midland Bank, designed by Lutyens on Poultry in 1924. The ability to use a huge steel frame in these buildings liberated Lutyens and his contemporaries from having to think of his facades in a structural sense. And so these facades were more playful, and as the Midland Bank shows, allowed Lutyens to play with classical elements, particularly rustication, which he fades out and he fades in. The whole building gradually contracts as it rises, because each course of stone is 1/8 of an inch less in height than the course below. So the whole building becomes sort of squeezed up towards the top. And it was this type of abstraction that was practiced by an architect we've already met, Charles Holden. This is his London University Senate House, seen here at night in a view by Raymond Walker. We've appreciated his great skill at building the monumental headquarters of London Underground. And here in Bloomsbury, he proved again that he was brilliant at making a big building interesting and lively. While clearly this is a building of the 20th century, it's built in 1932 to 1937, its proportions, I think, make it look like piled up sections of Georgian Bloomsbury, balconies and all. An almost exactly contemporary building by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott was the University Library in Cambridge, built in 1931 to 1934. Like Senate House, which of course contains a library, the great book stack was in a tower. And as befits Cambridge, the library is in brick. But if anything, it's more abstracted than Holden's Senate House. Can you see these great long, tall, slit windows, which sort of look like columns? They're clearly not classical columns, but they are clearly imitating the form. Even more abstracted is one of my favourite buildings in Liverpool, the monumental ventilation and control system at St George's Dock at the Pierhead in Liverpool. This remarkable structure was built in 1932 and designed by Herbert J. Rouse. The lower parts, I think, are very much anchored in the classical language. You can see the sort of Georgian-shaped windows and there's a rusticated ground floor. But as it rises, it becomes more and more abstract. We, I think, would probably call it Art Deco at the top. And as well as offices, the buildings contain the massive fans that ventilated the first Mersey road tunnel. And so, in fact, the tower is largely a great big chimney. Other architects were perhaps working more firmly in a historical use of the classical orders. Many of you here will know the Port of London Authority building in Trinity Square, just opposite the Tower of London. This was designed by Sir Edwin Cooper and was completed in 1922, and I think expresses the optimism and the extraordinary power and wealth and success of the controlling body of the world's largest port. One of the best architects working in the interwar period was Vincent Harris. Perhaps his best known building in London is the Ministry of Defence building on Whitehall. But for me, his finest building is perhaps Manchester Central Library, an extension to the City Hall he built in 1930 to 34. This was in an unashamedly Roman manner, bombastic even in its confidence, clearly inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, but also by a tour of contemporary American libraries he'd undertaken after winning the competition to build it. So, the effects of the First World War were to turn English architecture back in on itself. Though there were a few, mainly foreign architects interested in new types of architecture, the First World War produced no decisive break in the history of architectural design in England. The scene is now set for my next lecture, when we'll be able to probe further into the mentality of the interwar years. We'll look more closely at the struggle between modernity and tradition, and between the rural and the urban. And we'll look at the effects of these struggles on architectural design. So I very much hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you will join me in person and not digitally rendered on the 6th of February for Forwards and Backwards, the Art of Architecture in Interwar England. Thank you very much.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.